We are now going to look at the major muscles of the body. So here is a diagram of the major muscles of the body. So you've got the front and obviously the back. And on the next slide, we're going to look at these muscles in a bit more detail. So first, we're looking at the shoulder joint. So the movement, flexion of the shoulder joint. The agonist of this would be the anterior deltoid, and the origin of the anterior deltoid is the lateral clavicle, and the insertion of the anterior deltoid would be the deltoid tuberosity, which is found at the humerus, and the antagonist of this movement would be the posterior deltoid. Therefore, extension of the shoulder, since the agonist is the posterior deltoid, the antagonist would then be the anterior deltoid. The origin is also the same at the lateral clavicle, but is in a slightly different position to it, and the insertion also is at deltoid tuberosity, which is found at the humerus. Abduction at the shoulder is with the agonist of the medial deltoid, and the antagonist of this would be the latissimus dorsi. The origin of this is also the lateral clavicle, and the insertion of this is also at the deltoid tuberosity, which is found at the humerus. Adduction at the shoulder is performed by the agonist, which is the latissimus dorsi, and the origin of the latissimus dorsi is from the 7th thoracic vertebrae to the 5th lumbar vertebrae, and the insertion of the latissimus dorsi is the bicipital groove of the humerus. And the antagonist of this movement would be the medial deltoid. Now, lateral and medial rotation at the shoulder. The agonist muscle to create this movement would be the rotator cuff muscles. The origin of the rotator cuff muscles is the supraspinous fossa, which is found at the scapula, and there are many origins and insertions of the rotator cuff muscles, as there are multiple rotator cuff muscles, but I've just included one as an example, but they are a pair. So the origin and the insertion go together in this case. So the greater tubercle of the humerus is the insertion as well. Is the insertion. And so the antagonist of this would be the other rotator cuff muscles. So the medial rotator cuff muscles and the lateral rotator cuff muscles work in an antagonistic pair to create lateral and medial rotation. Horizontal flexion at the shoulder. The agonist would be the pectoralis major. The origin of this would be the medial part of the clavicle. The middle area of the clavicle. The insertion of this would be at the lateral end of the bicipital groove of the humerus, and the antagonist would be the trapezius, working not against, but creating slight resistance to the pectoralis major. At the radio-ulnar joint here, supination is occurred with the agonist being the supinators, and the origin of this would be the supinator crest of the ulna. The insertion of the supinators would be the lateral surface of the radius, and the antagonist of the supinators would be the pronator teres. To create pronation movement at the radio-ulnar joint, the agonist would be the pronator teres. The origin would be the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulna. The insertion of this would be the lateral surface of the diaphysis of the radius. And the antagonist would be the supinators. At the elbow joint, flexion would occur with the agonist being the biceps brachii, and the origins would be the supraclinoid tubercle at the scapula and the coracoid process at the scapula. See, they're numbered as the bicep has 2 origins and the triceps has 3 origins. The insertion of the biceps brachii would be the radial tuberosity, and the antagonist would be the triceps brachii. For extension to happen, the agonist would be the triceps brachii, and the origins of this is the infraclinoid tubercle at the scapula, and the second and third head of the triceps would be at the posterior surface at the humerus. The insertion of the triceps brachii is the ulcranum process at the ulna, and the antagonist is the biceps brachii. At the hip joint, flexion would occur with the agonist being the iliopsoas. The origin of the iliopsoas is the thoracic 12th vertebrae to the 4th lumbar vertebrae. And the insertion of the iliopsoas would be the lesser trochanter at the femur, and the antagonist of the iliopsoas would be, or the antagonist to the iliopsoas would be the gluteus maximus. For extension to occur, the agonist would be the gluteus maximus, and the origin of the gluteus maximus would be the surface of the posterior part of the ilium. The ilium is part of the pelvis. The insertion of the gluteus maximus would be the gluteal tuberosity at the femur, and the antagonist of the gluteus maximus would be the iliopsoas. For abduction to take place, the gluteus medius and minimus would work together as the agonist, and the origin of these is the lateral surface of the ilium. The insertion of the gluteus medius and minimus would be the lateral surface of the trochanter at the femur, and the agonist of this would be the adductors. So for adduction to take place, the agonist would be the adductors. The origin of the adductors is the pubis, which is the bottom of the pelvis. The insertion of the adductors is the linea aspera at the femur, and the antagonist of the adductors would be the gluteus medius and minimus. At the ankle joint, dorsiflexion can occur, and the agonist of this movement, or the agonist creating this movement effectively, would be the tibialis anterior. The origin of the tibialis anterior is the lateral condyle at the tibia, and the insertion of the tibialis anterior is the base of the first metatarsal in the foot. And the antagonist to this movement would be plantar flexion. Would be the gastrocnemius and soleus. Don't know why I put that there. For plantar flexion to occur, the agonist would be the gastrocnemius and soleus, and the origin of the gastrocnemius and soleus is the medial and lateral condyle at the femur. The insertion of the gastrocnemius and soleus would be the posterior calcaneus, and the antagonist would be the tibialis anterior. The tibialis anterior and the gastrocnemius and soleus work as an antagonistic pair. So when one is the agonist, the others will be the antagonist. So ignore that column there. At the knee joint, flexion would occur with the agonist being the hamstrings. The hamstrings include the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. And the origin of the hamstrings, the origin of the biceps femoris, specifically, as it is responsible for creating the most movement, is the most important one of the three hamstrings, of the three muscles that make up the hamstrings. And the origin of the biceps femoris is the os coxa. The insertion of the biceps femoris would be the lateral condyle at the tibia, and the antagonist of this movement, the antagonist muscle, would be the quadriceps, and that includes the rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, vastus intermedialis, and the vastus lateralis. For extension to take place, the agonist muscles would then be the quadriceps group. The origin of the rectus femoris, as that one, just like the biceps femoris, is the one which is most responsible in creating that movement, even though they all make that movement, but the rectus femoris is the most important out of those four. And so the origin of the rectus femoris is the anterior iliac and ilium, found in the pelvis. The insertion of the rectus femoris is the tibial tuberosity, and the antagonist would be the hamstrings group. In the spine, lateral flexion and rotation occurs with the agonist being the internal obliques, and the origin of the internal obliques would be the anterior iliac crest, and the insertion of the internal obliques would be the costal cartilages of the 8th to 12th ribs, and the antagonist of the internal obliques would be the external obliques. And now lateral flexion and rotation occurs again, but this time in the other direction. And that is done with the agonist being the external obliques, because that also can create this movement. And the origin of this would be in the external surface of the 5th to 12th ribs. And the insertion of the external obliques is the anterior iliac crest, and the antagonist of the external obliques is the internal obliques. For flexion at the spine to take place, the agonist of this is the rectus abdominalis, and the origin of the rectus abdominalis is the pubic crest, and the insertion of the rectus abdominalis is the costal cartilage of the 5th to 7th ribs, and the antagonist is the erector spinae. Therefore, for extension to take place, the agonist would be the erector spinae, and the origin of the erector spinae is the iliac crest, and the insertion of the erector spinae is the transverse and spinous processes at the vertebrae, and the antagonist would be the rectus abdominalis. That is going to be the end of this video, and next video we will look at different muscle fiber types, the structure of the muscle fibers and the functions they serve.